Ford and John Deere recently halted production in the United States. Trump's response wasn't just a statement, it was a harsh warning to the heartland. In a bold move, these giants of American manufacturing walked away from local jobs, leaving factories silent. The president, who had promised to revive American industry, retaliated with aggressive tariffs that risked destabilizing the very communities he aimed to protect. This wasn't just economic strategy, it felt deeply personal. Why did these iconic companies abandon their American roots? Why did Trump's retaliation backfire so disastrously? And what does this mean for jobs, savings, and the future? The reality was more complex than many knew, or perhaps even Trump himself realized. John Deere had quietly begun a global reorganization long before tariffs hit, setting up new plants in Brazil, automating lines in Germany, and expanding significantly in India. Internally, John Deere executives shifted focus from maintaining American production to surviving without it, anticipating instability in both the market and Washington. This wasn't defiance, it was adaptation to political volatility. Meanwhile, Ford, unlike John Deere, quietly shifted major electric vehicle production to Mexico and Vietnam, reducing costs and optimizing operations away from public scrutiny. While Trump criticized foreign dependence, Ford silently advanced its plans abroad, focusing on efficiency rather than political loyalty. Despite outward appearances, with American flags on their trucks, beneath the surface, Ford had strategically pivoted. Loyalty to politicians didn't drive decisions, financial prudence did. But Trump wasn't going to walk away quietly. He saw it as a betrayal, a test of loyalty, and one he believed the big corporations had failed. For years, Trump had branded himself as the savior of American industry. He wore hard hats at rallies, promised to revive Detroit, and praised John Deere as a symbol of American innovation. These companies weren't just businesses, they were part of his political identity. He believed they owed him, so when they pulled out, quietly, cleanly, and without explanation, he took it as a personal insult. He lashed out, calling it betrayal, even labeling it treason in a Truth Social post. But beneath the angry words was something deeper, the realization that his influence couldn't bend corporate decision-making. His so-called loyalty test failed because it was based on a fantasy that he could govern massive corporations, the same way he rallied voters, with slogans and emotional appeals. But companies aren't voters. They don't chant, wear red hats, or follow personalities. They follow markets. And when it came down to it, Ford and Deere didn't plead or explain, they simply left. The truth is, the unspoken deal Trump assumed, I protect you, you stay loyal, never really existed. It was political theater. Ford and Deere didn't want protection, they needed stability, and Trump's return offered the opposite. What crumbled wasn't just a policy, it was an entire worldview. Across the Midwest, in workshops and diners, people felt the shift. No one shouted or cried. But something broke, the illusion of made in America, the dream of an industrial comeback, the myth of patriotic corporations. And in Iowa, that illusion fully shattered. The Iowa event was supposed to be a celebration, a show of strength, loyalty, and industrial pride. But when Trump stepped on stage, he didn't inspire, he stunned. The crowd, farmers, factory workers, Ford loyalists, came with their families, flags, and faith. What they got was a bombshell, a 200% tariff on John Deere, products made overseas, and a 25% tariff on imported Ford vehicles. There wasn't cheering, there was confusion. You could see it in the crowd as they calculated costs. What would a new combine cost next season? Could they still afford a new truck? Some tried to clap, but most just sat there, lips tight, minds racing. Iowa isn't just any state. It's Deere country. It's Ford country. These aren't just logos, they're the tools of everyday life, woven into the fabric of the land. So when Trump turned on them, it didn't feel like he was punishing executives in distant cities. It felt like he was going after the tractors that plow the fields, the trucks that carry crops, the vehicles that bring kids to school. And then the exodus began. Slow, quiet, almost surreal. No shouting, no anger. Just rows of people silently leaving, as if waking up from a long, uneasy dream. At truck stops and breakfast counters, the talk had changed. Some were angry, others were just sad. Everyone was thinking the same thing, doing the math. Because the belief that Trump and the working class were in perfect sync, that idea had cracked, and the crack wasn't going to heal. Meanwhile, in corporate boardrooms, the game was already in motion. While Trump was stoking political flames across the Midwest, inside the polished towers of Ford and John Deere, no one was caught off guard. There were no emergency meetings, no scrambling, just quiet execution of long-prepared plans. These companies had seen the storm coming. Contingency planning wasn't a reaction. It was built into their strategy. By the time Trump issued his threats, both firms were already months into their pivots. At Ford's headquarters, legal teams had simulated every possible trade outcome. They weren't fazed by social media tirades. They had entire teams of lawyers, analysts, and lobbyists quietly working the levers of power in Congress. Their PR department had already prepared talking points for conservative outlets, painting their international moves not as betrayal, but as smart defensive strategies. The messaging was sticking. Rust Belt newspapers were running op-eds about global competitiveness, and talk radio hosts were brushing off the tariffs as short-term bumps. At John Deere, the response was even more aggressive. The company had diversified its supply chain well in advance, routes through Brazil, backup suppliers in India, and fully automated European factories that could scale up production. Deere's executives weren't afraid of retaliation, they anticipated it, and they had the leverage to wait it out. What Trump failed to grasp was simple. You can't bully multinational corporations with nationalistic slogans. These companies don't answer to flags, they answer to profit margins. In an unstable world, stability wins over patriotism. The CEOs weren't clashing with Trump on cable news. They were outmaneuvering him quietly, with strategy, data, and discipline. But in small towns, the silence was starting to echo. In places like Ottawa, Iowa, and Van Buren, Arkansas, the fallout didn't start with protests. It began with a whisper, then hesitation, then a sudden hush. Dealerships once filled with conversation and engine sounds went quiet. Service bays sat idle. Sales staff stared at their phones, waiting for customers who no longer showed up. In the days after Trump's tariff announcement, foot traffic dropped nearly 30%. Farmers canceled orders. Mechanics suddenly had wide-open schedules. One dealership manager said it felt like someone flipped a switch and shut the business off. Another said he hadn't seen fear like this, not even during the Great Recession. Layoffs began discreetly. Hours were cut. Sales teams shrank. And the Trump flags that once hung proudly in showroom windows were being taken down, not in anger, but in survival. Talking politics at the counter had become bad for business. Customers weren't just frustrated, they were worried. And anxious buyers don't sign contracts. This wasn't just about economics, it was about identity. These dealerships weren't just selling machines, they were anchors in their communities. They sponsored youth teams, ran food drives, and employed generations of families who believed in American industry, in Trump's vision, in the idea that the Midwest was finally rising again. Now they felt discarded, exploited, left to take the blow while corporations moved on and politicians kept talking. And Wall Street, it was ready to light the next fuse. The tariffs backfired almost immediately. The numbers told the story. Prices for new John Deere combined spiked more than 25%. Ford's F-Series trucks soared past what average buyers could afford. Replacement parts, filters, belts, transmissions suddenly cost more and took longer to arrive. But the real damage wasn't just at the register, it was digital. TikTok videos comparing past and present prices went viral. Facebook groups for farmers and truck owners filled with spreadsheets, rants, and calls for boycotts. Hashtags spread. Memes mocked the administration. The backlash was no longer emotional, it was documented, and trust was breaking down. Not just in Trump, not just in Ford or Deere, but in the very idea of the American dream. That if you work hard, buy American and invest in your town, the system will reward you. That belief was unraveling. Fast. Parents who once proudly encouraged their kids to build trucks or tractors were now urging them to reconsider. Diesel mechanics started eyeing warehouse jobs. Dealership managers dusted off resumes and looked toward finance, real estate, anywhere else. Entire communities were beginning to shift, uncertain and disillusioned. What they thought the future looked like was gone, and it wasn't green and yellow or red, white, and blue. It was something else, somewhere else. The tariffs were pitched as a patriotic defense of American manufacturing. In practice, they became a self-inflicted wound, driving up prices, driving down confidence, and eroding decades of brand loyalty. And for retirees in the American heartland, the real pain hadn't even started. Ford collapsed, and with it, so did retirement. It began with a red line on a monitor. By the time Trump stepped off stage in Iowa, Ford's stock was already in free fall. Within 48 hours, it had lost over 27% of its value, tens of billions. Wiped out faster than a Netflix binge. Wall Street saw a brutal correction. But in rural America, it felt like a death sentence. Because Ford wasn't just a car company, it was a retirement plan. In towns across Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, public pension funds had long invested heavily in Ford stock. It was considered a blue-chip symbol of American resilience. Teachers, police officers, firefighters, and sanitation workers all depended on those dividends. They didn't need CNBC to know things were bad. They saw it in their quarterly statements, heard it in the panicked calls flooding credit unions. Municipalities were under sudden strain. County pension boards met in emergency sessions. Volunteer fire departments slashed overtime. School districts postponed repairs, froze hiring, and began preparing for shortfalls. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real. A retired Ford worker in Toledo watched his retirement savings dip below break-even. A teacher in Indiana found her small but vital dividend gone without warning. Across the Rust Belt, the feeling was universal. They'd done what? They were told, trusted American companies, invested locally, believed in the system, and now that system was collapsing. The very companies they built were vanishing and taking their future with them, and it still wasn't over. Because behind Ford, Deere was falling too. John Deere's Wall Street collapse wasn't chaos, it was choreography. When Trump confirmed a 200% tariff on agricultural equipment built overseas, institutional investors didn't wait for clarification. They moved fast. Within 5 trading days, Deere lost more than $36 billion in market cap. This wasn't fear. It was a coordinated retreat. Mutual funds rebalanced, index funds slashed exposure. Even the so-called patriotic investment firms, the ones that clung to legacy American brands out of principle, quietly started selling. They'd seen enough. The narrative had flipped. This wasn't about patriotism anymore. It wasn't about backing American brands. It was about surviving a political storm. Inside John Deere headquarters, damage control went into overdrive. Emergency earnings calls, investor memos rewritten twice in the same day. Behind closed doors, executives scrambled, dialing the lawmakers they used to wine and dine. But it was too late. Wall Street had spoken, and its verdict was brutal. This wasn't just a rejection of Deere. It was a referendum on the Trump economy itself. The message was loud and clear. Even America's most iconic companies were no longer safe from presidential impulse. If Trump could turn on Deere, he could turn on anyone. And the boardrooms knew it. The CEO rebellion begins. They didn't call it a mutiny, at least not publicly. But behind the tinted windows of Gulf Streams and in the private suites of Manhattan and Palo Alto, America's most powerful CEOs were beginning to fight back. Quietly. It started with unrecorded dinners, closed-door summits at private golf clubs, and off-the-record retreats. The guest lists. Top names from autos, ag, tech, logistics, and finance. They all had the same problem: uncertainty. Trump's economic aggression had evolved from strategy to liability. Tariffs imposed without warning, longtime allies punished without process. The cost was no longer hypothetical. Legal teams were ordered to explore constitutional options. Economic advisors drafted internal white papers branding Trump's trade actions as market destabilization. And campaign donations began to shift, not toward Democrats necessarily, but toward alternatives, primary challengers, independent, Republicans, anyone who could promise stability over chaos. No statements, no headlines, no press releases. This wasn't a PR war. It was a war fought with capital. Hiring freezes were imposed. Strategic offshoring, once too politically risky, was quietly greenlit. Investments were delayed. In rural America, the effects weren't visible yet. But in corporate America, the shift was already underway. These CEOs weren't activists. They weren't revolutionaries. They were survivalists, and they had made a calculation. Trump was no longer good for business. While boardrooms scrambled to protect their futures, everyday Americans were waking up to a different kind of betrayal. Not from companies, but from the very government that was supposed to protect them. And by the time they looked up, the shift had already happened. The US-Mexico-China shift was already complete. While politicians argued on cable news and rallies echoed with empty promises to bring jobs home, the global economy had already moved on. The industrial rebirth that America had been waiting for? It wasn't delayed. It was outsourced, not temporarily. Permanently. Detroit wasn't the center of the next revolution. It was Guanajuato, Mexico, where Ford was finalizing a massive new electric vehicle facility. Not Dearborn. Not Ohio. Mexico. John Deere's new supplier pipeline bypassed America entirely, stretching from Pune, India, to Recife, Brazil. In Shenzhen, robotics factories were churning out the automation hardware that now powered Deere's and Ford's global operations, replacing Midwestern labor with lightning-fast assembly bots. This wasn't anecdotal. It wasn't speculative. In just 5 years, U.S. manufacturing investment declined by double digits, while Mexico's industrial capital spending surged to record highs. From Baja to Querétaro, entire megazones of hyper-connected, AI-driven factories were rising, monuments to a new industrial age that no longer needed America's Rust Belt. The future had moved on, and it wasn't coming back. Mexico was no longer a minor player. It had become a hub for light machinery, electronics, and battery components, swallowing up operations that once defined small-town Illinois and Indiana. America wasn't losing. A trade war. It was being written out of the script. And the most jarring part: corporate America wasn't asking for permission. It wasn't waiting for Washington to stabilize. It wasn't betting on the next election to bring clarity. It was moving, fast, and it was moving for one reason: survival. Labor was cheaper abroad. Tax incentives were bigger. Supply chains were faster. Environmental regulations were looser, or in some places, non-existent. From the boardroom's perspective, the logic was brutal but obvious. Building in America had become a liability. Trump's 200% tariff on Deere's foreign-built equipment didn't scare executives. It confirmed they'd made the right call. If strategic planning meant economic punishment, then there was only one rational response: move faster, further, quieter. Ford and Deere weren't hedging. They were relocating for good. Why Ford and Deere? May never return, some still believe these moves are temporary, a reaction to volatility, a response to politics. But anyone who's ever stepped into a multinational boardroom knows the truth. This isn't a reaction, it's evolution. And the direction of that evolution. It no longer includes a meaningful manufacturing footprint in the United States. There were no press conferences, no ribbon cuttings, no flashy photo ops. These weren't announcements. They were erasures. Ford/domestic plant investment with a few lines buried in an earnings call. John Deere relocated key assembly lines from Illinois and Iowa, hidden deep in a shareholder slide deck under efficiency optimization. Why the silence? Because they knew what it would sound like to American workers. Abandonment. And that's exactly what it was. In India, Deere was capitalizing on a booming ag market, a rising middle class, and labor costs that were a fraction of what they paid in the US. In Mexico, it wasn't just about saving money, it was about access. 2. Latin American markets, favorable trade pacts, and flexible regulations. For both companies, these weren't just smart business decisions. They were survival tactics in a global economy where speed and flexibility mattered more than patriotic symbolism. Meanwhile, America had become something else. A battlefield of tariffs, legal threats, unpredictable rules, wrapped in a haze of cultural warfare and political theater. To multinational executives, it wasn't just frustrating, it was untenable. The hard truth: America could no longer compete. The spreadsheets didn't lie. The ROI was better abroad, and in a world where loyalty wasn't rewarded, but punished, corporations made the only logical choice: stability over nostalgia. But the collapse wasn't just economic, it was emotional. And through it all, no one protected the middle class. Who really lost this war? This wasn't a war between Trump and corporate America. It wasn't a war between left and right. It was a war against the American people, and they lost. Farmers were promised that tariffs would protect them. Now they pay tens of thousands more for the same Deere tractors they've used for decades. Back orders are endless. Parts are scarce. Repairs delayed by months. Some farms are going under, not from drought, not from debt, but because their tools became politically toxic. Factory workers were promised jobs would return. Instead, they watched their towns shrink. Their wages stagnate. Their futures vanish, not because of foreign competition, but because of domestic failure. Deere was hemorrhaging capital, and no amount of Midwestern loyalty could stop the bleeding. To the market, this wasn't just a dip in performance, it was a signal. Deere, once the unshakable symbol of American agriculture, was now politically toxic. a radioactive asset. The myth of immunity shattered. Its iconic status as the pride of the heartland meant nothing to investor algorithms calculating risk. What once stood for strength now looked like liability.